Okay, so what I want to do today is talk about how I'm grading your CTEs and what you guys need to be doing with them, because there are some very vague responses that I'm getting. So first off, when you're doing one of the primary source analyses, you actually have to analyze the primary sources. Obviously, the week 3 analysis of the colonial women, of your choice from the Colliding Cultures chapter of the American Yawp Reader, which were all basically British and Native American. Christopher Columbus was not in that chapter. He was in chapter 1. I went ahead and graded those, but that's not one you should have been using. You can't discuss a primary source. You can't make assertions about it without giving quotes from it to demonstrate where you're getting your interpretations. And most of you didn't, for some reason, do that. This not only applies to primary source use, but also to secondary sources. You can't say Lepore is a revisionist historian without giving me a specific example of where you see that in her work. And when you cite Lepore, she should also always have a page number. So if you're making very broad assertions and you're not giving me support, then you're missing the whole point of what you're supposed to be doing in the course. You prove things or you show where you're getting your ideas by using quotes from your sources. The same thing applies in all of the critical thinking analyses. If you're going to analyze primary source, you're going to use quotes from it to discuss bias and to give me demonstrations of how the people in the past thought differently from the way we do today. If you're doing a secondary source analysis, you're going to give quotes from the sources that you're using. For week 4, it was from Lepore. When you were doing the week 5 on gender in the colonies, you should have been using all 5 of those primary sources and using quotes from them. When you did the week 6 analysis of the bias of the 4 sources you were using, you should definitely have been using quotes from all of those to demonstrate. So this is a big part of why, for many of you, straight off the bat, your grades are low. Some of you are still not giving me internal citation, and certainly not nearly enough. That's going to bring your grade down as well. In fact, it's a 0 if you don't use internal citation and give me a work cited, because that's de facto plagiarism. All right, so this is the rubric, which you should have seen, that I use for anything that involves the primary sources. You have a general knowledge category. You have a critical thinking category, you have the primary sources themselves category, and then you have your citation and clarity. General knowledge, how are you putting these sources into historical context if it's a primary source? So that means giving me the foundational background for that source. Critical thinking is considering the biases and using quotes to support how you get to that bias in that analysis. Primary sources themselves require that you use quotes from them. So if you're not doing that, you're not going to get a good grade here. And this is effectively 1/3 of the grade on anything doing with a primary source. So you definitely want to be sure that you are using quotes from primary sources in order to prove your point, or to at least demonstrate to me what you're talking about. For secondary sources, this is my answer guide for the Lepore, right? Okay, so here's the first thing. The thesis for Lepore was on page, I have it here as 34, I think it's actually 36. Beginning with the Virginia Charter, the idea of English liberties for English subjects was planted on American soil, and with it, the king's claim to dominion, a claim that rested on the idea that people like Powhatan and his people lived in darkness and without government, no matter that the English called their leaders kings. And that's what she spends the entire rest of the chapter proving. For historiography, many of you gave me the types of history she's using, which is good, but you didn't give me specific examples. But historiography in this case, she's comparing the rule of Powhatan against the rule of James the First. Native versus Briton, also slave versus white. She definitely talks about women because she spends a lot of this chapter talking about Jane Franklin versus men and gender. So she's doing a lot of social history, as many of you point out. She's doing a lot of gender history. She's doing a lot of intellectual history because she spends a lot of time talking about the evolution of the ideas that will establish what English liberty is. So the thesis itself is worth 5 points, and you had to quote it. You couldn't just tell me what it was about. In fact, the instructions explicitly say, what is the thesis? Please quote it and give the correct citation with page number. Right? Okay. So that first section right there is worth 15 points. The next section on the sourcing is worth 40 total points. And for that, it's not just enough to tell me the types of sources. You needed to give me specific examples of her primary sources. And she uses a lot. Now, many of you mentioned Locke, but there are also, good Lord, look at this. She uses Powhatan's deerskin cloak on page 31, comparing it to James's scarlet cloak on page 32. She uses Thomas Paine on page 34, the Virginia's first charter on page 34. She uses Edward Coke, 34 to 36, 40 to 42. John Smith, George Percy, Thomas Hobbes, a random slave trader that she doesn't explicitly name, William Bradford, the Magna Carta, King James I, it's ad infinitum. She uses primary sources on every page. And if you gave me just some general, she uses letters and she uses, okay, those are the types of primary sources she uses, but that's not specific enough. You need to be specific. She also discusses conflicts in many of these, like the comparison of the different intentions and meanings of Powhatan's deerskin robe versus James I's scarlet one. James I versus John Locke and Thomas Paine, Powhatan versus the Jamestown settlers on subjugation, Coke using the Magna Carta against James I, the irony of the English coming to save natives and enslaving them. Many of you did point that one out, but you didn't give me page numbers for it. The contradiction of English condemning Portuguese for slavery, yet adopting it themselves. The contradiction of creating laws to justify slavery, which also helped to define freedom. Milton versus Parliament, Locke versus the natives, evolution of freedom of the press from James Franklin through the Zinger trial. I mean, there are just lots of different conflicts that she discusses in here in this discussion of these primary sources. So these are all literally comparative. So she's taking them from the sourcing itself, from the time period itself, and saying, here are these things that are going on even there. She also uses a lot of secondary sources. Now, she doesn't always quote them in her chapters. Instead, she'll make references to them. And with all secondary source look, you almost always have to look at the endnotes. Anywhere she has a footnote registered, there's usually a reference to a secondary source as well. And early on, she uses Wazelkov's Indian Maps of Colonial Southeast. She uses lots of David Armitage, and many of you pointed out that she used a lot of Atlantic history in her historiography. Yes, she does. David Armitage is one of the preeminent Atlantic historians. And she refers to herself a lot, especially when she's talking about Jane Franklin, because she wrote a book about Jane Franklin. Many of her primary quotes are also taken from a lot of secondary writings as well. And you'll see that in the notes as well. But you needed to give me some specifics there. Specifically, and again, you'll have to look at the notes to do that quite often. All right. Does Lepore make a valid argument using historical support? Is there a different way to interpret her supporting documentation? And the answer to this is yes, but also yes. She demonstrates a lot of it, and she gives a lot of examples of that, and you needed to give me examples of that as well. And then question 4 is worth 35 points because it requires you to look not just at Lepore, but to compare her to the textbook in your multimedia and to demonstrate or prove your analysis of her and of them by using quotes and examples from them. If you want to tell, well, and you're supposed to tell me which of the 3 do you think is most historically valid and why, you need to give me some specific examples. And many of you did not do that. You just made bland assertions about the textbook, that it just reads like a textbook. Okay, great. What does that mean? And you didn't give me any specific examples comparatively. So that's going to be a big part of why your secondary source analysis, again, is not going to be as good as you think it should be, because you don't show me anything. What you have to do is give me examples. This is partly to demonstrate that you've actually read the material and you're actually thinking about it critically, but it is also to demonstrate that you're thinking about it critically, that you are looking for these things and internalizing them in how you analyze the documents. All right. So this is where we are with doing primary and secondary sourcing. The week 5 on gender in the colonies, that required that you use all 5 of those primary sources, which means quotes from them. If you're going to tell me women stayed at home and were gender segregated, then give me some quotes from those sources to prove that. But you could also have pointed out that while there were expectations one way, often women found ways around them. And then you could have used quotes from the primary sources to demonstrate that as well. If there were no quotes from your primary sources, you didn't do a primary source analysis. So that's going to be what's going to hurt your grade on that. For the week 6 on the American Revolution, if you're going to argue the bias of a source, you need to give me quotes to demonstrate that. And virtually no one did with that one. I had a larger number of people who, for some reason, didn't use any citation in that one also. And I'm like, we all know that's a no-no. So I'm not sure what happened there. But again, my point with all of these critical thinking analyses is they are exactly that. They are analyses. And to support an analysis, to support an assumption that you're making about something, you have to give quotes from it to show me that. All right. You have more of those you can do, and hopefully now you have a better handle on what you're supposed to be doing with those. If I emailed you individually, please respond to me, because I am not going to grade. If I emailed you that there was a problem with your AI rating and I need to know why, and you don't respond to me, I'm assuming by default that there's an intentional use of AI, in which case your grade's going to be a 0 for that one. As I mentioned in the email, if you're using Grammarly, you must note that. Turnitin has actually 2 different AI ratings. It has an originality AI rating, as in it looks like most of the paper, or some percentage of the paper, was actually written by AI. But it also has an AI rating for use in editing. So you need to be very sure that if you're using Grammarly, that you note that in your paper somewhere, so that I know that you use Grammarly, and I'm not going to be looking for originality AI instead of the editing AI. All right, if you have any questions, first of all, look at your grades, look at my comments on your papers, and I'm sorry they are spare because I'm playing catch up. And then if you don't understand what I'm talking about, feel free to email me and I will try to get back to you. For many of you who have emailed me, I'm trying to use this video to answer many of your questions. If there's one in particular that I did not specific to you, email me again and remind me. But bear in mind that examples are how we demonstrate what we are arguing, how we support what we're arguing. So what I tend to say specifically, the one word I think I used the most was examples. Examples, quotes, specific examples, quotes, things like that. Those are because you have a lot of assertions that are not supported. So that's what we're trying to learn how not to do. It is how to prove what we're doing by giving examples. All right. Again, if you have questions, email me and let me know.